this is Joe Bolen, and today we're going to learn about variables, also called identifiers. Variables are what gives to a computer program its power. Because variables allow the flexibility to change values, we can then input different values to see different results, and that gives us the power of programming. So we select what we want to input in the computer, we process that information with variables, and then we output that data either to a printer or to a screen, or perhaps even to a audio output. So let's take a look at variables, because they are very important. You need to understand about them. So let's take a look at about declaring variables. And I have on the screen some basic rules to declare variables. First of all, when you declare a variable for your program, it cannot be a Visual Basic keyword or reserve word. Those are set aside for the programming language. Therefore, we've got to come up with our own variables, and they should be descriptive of what we are going to store in those variables. Now, variables basically are like an address to a person's home or apartment. The address points to the actual apartment or home on that. So a variable is like an address that points to a place in memory in the computer where we're going to store a value. So we want it to be descriptive for us to easily understand and see, and we can begin it with an underscore character, but not recommended. You should use an alphabetic character to name your variable names. Also, the variables can have any alphabetic characters, A to Z, and can include numbers and the underscore. But once again, I'm suggesting you do not use the underscore. The other thing is, it has to have at least one alphabetic character or a decimal digit if it begins with an underscore. And this is why, once again, I do not recommend beginning with an underscore. Now, one of the things that we can do is name our variables as big as 123 characters long. Oh, please don't do that. Try to be short but descriptive in naming your variables. Now, let's look at some good practices in naming our variables. First of all, we want our variable to be descriptive, as I said before. So we'll name a variable index or counter, but not IDX or X. These are short descriptive type variables used long ago in programming when we did not have as much power to name our variable names. We were limited in how big a variable name could be. So we want to be descriptive nowadays as we name our variables. Only use letters and digits. Now, you can use the underscore, but good programming practice today is not to use the underscore. You will see in older programs, programmers still using the underscore character. But in today's standards, this is not recommended. As we name a variable and make it descriptive, we'll probably have a multi-word variable. And we'll begin that with a lowercase for the first character of the word, then uppercase for each of the first characters of the following words. So if we had a variable that we called sales total, we would begin it out in lowercase sales, then the first character of the second word would be uppercase on that. And this is what's called camel case on that. So for variables that we're declaring in our program, we'll use camel case naming convention. Now, you'll see sometimes people wanting to put prefixes to variable names to try to identify what the variable is. That style, called Hungarian notation, is now out of favor. And therefore, we're going to go with the new modern standards of using camel casing for our variable names, and we'll try to avoid using the underscore character. Well, let's get into Visual Basic and actually see the process of naming a variable and using it in a program. So I have Visual Studio up, and I'm going to start a new project. And this project is going to be a console application. I'm just going to call it variable demo. And hit OK. And I'm going to go full screen here. And I'm going to change the output so it's easier to read. I have basically a very simple module type program for a console output, and we'll put in the basic parts we need for a console application. Console write line and console read key. Those two will bring up the console with the write line, and then the read key will hold the console open until we hit a key on the keyboard. So with that in mind, we're ready to begin looking at declaring our variables. Now, as I said, we have to tell the computer what our variable is in terms of we need to make a reservation in memory, much like you would make a reservation if you were going to go to a hotel or motel. You'd call and say, I need to have a bed for tonight. So basically we're saying we're going to give it a name by using the dim keyword to declare our variable. Then we're going to give it a name, and I'm going to be not too descriptive with this one. I'm just going to call it a value as our variable. And the squiggly lines underneath basically are saying I have not used this variable yet, and it's reminding me that it's unused at this point in time. So I've got a variable that I've called a value in my project. Now I still am going to have to use a little bit of hard coding for this one because I don't have an input field to receive data. But we can take a value, and what we're going to do is assign to it a value. And we use the equal sign to assign to the field on the left of the equal sign whatever we put on the right side. So this is an assignment operator, not so much a mathematical symbol of calculations. So in this case, I'm going to assign it a literal string. And this one's in quotes, so I'm going to say hello world. So I've assigned to it a little string, hard coding in this case, a value here that I'm going to assign to the variable a value. Now I'm going to have a value in my output. So when I come in, I've declared that I'm going to need some space in the computer, and I'm going to name this one a value, and it'll point to a place in memory. Then I'm going to come down and I'm going to put the little string of hello world and assign it to that value in memory that I've called a value. Then I'm going to bring up the console and write a line with the value of a value. So we should see when I run this, the console pop up and say hello world. Let's do it. I'll hit the start debug. And there is our hello world popping up as we run it. So I've taken the variable that I've declared, I've assigned it a string literal of hello world as a value. I then assigned it into that location that a value points to, and then upon processing the right line, I'm reading the value that a value points to in memory and bringing it up on the screen. Okay, let us look at a number in this case. This time I'm going to put a number in here, and this time I'll use 3.1416, which is a short version of pi. So I've assigned 3.1416, which is a number in this case. There are no quotation marks around it, and I'm assigning it to a value. And this time we'll see that number being retrieved from memory and presented on our screen. And in fact, we see 3.1416. Okay, well, that's a very simple understanding of declaring a value, but let's now look at it in a different way with a number of variables. So let's have, instead of just a value, a first number, and I'll dim a second number. In this case, the first number is going to be, I'll say first number is going to be 10. And the second number is going to be 5. So what I've been doing at this point, I've declared two variables, first number and second number, and then I've assigned the value of a number 10 to first number and a value of 5 to the second number location in memory. Then I'm going to print out onto the screen first number times second number. And what we'll see happen is the value that's in the place for first number will be multiplied by the value in second number's location, and then that product will then be written to the screen. So we should see the value of 50 written when I run this project. And there's 50. Now let's see it as something we might do in a school project, or maybe a project where we need to worry about doing the calculations for a circumference of a circle. So let's declare our first value as radius and our second value as circumference. Okay, now radius, in my example, I'm going to make 5. And I'm going to not use the second number right now, but what I'm going to be using is the radius of 5. And if you'll remember that the circumference is equal to radius times 2 pi. So we're going to get the circumference and assign to it 2 times pi. Now I can put in 3.1416 here times the radius. And then I'm going to output the circumference to my screen. So I've inputted the value of 5 that will be stored in a location that I've called radius, and I'm going to then use the calculations of 2 pi r, and so the 5 will be retrieved here, read in from memory, processed out with multiplication, and the value of that process will then be assigned to the variable named circumference. And then when we come down to right line, circumference variable will be referenced in memory and pulled up and written to the console. So let's run this. And we see we get the value of 31.415. Now, just remember, we also have a function that I made use of earlier, and we can go to the math function. This is the math class, and I can get the pi class on that. And so we'll see that I can bring up pi as a internal value that the computer has, and I can be very precise at this point now, and we'll see the circumference get a value when I run this. And so now we see it even more precise than I had it before when I hard-coded in the value for pi. So a variable is a way for us to be very flexible in our coding. Now, you noticed that here I had two objects that I named radius and circumference. This is very poor programming practice, the way I've done it at this point in time. As I bring up other lessons, we'll get more definitive on how we declare our variables. So do not get in the habit of naming variables with the dim and the variable name alone. We'll talk more about declaring by a data type, and we'll see the variables being used with an input instead of hard coding values in place like I had here with the radius of 5. So this gives you an idea of how to do variables in your program. We're going to be very descriptive in our naming of variables. We're going to use what's called camel casing. The first part of the variable name will be in lowercase. Then the second part or third part of the naming of the variable name will begin with an uppercase letter, and each word following will begin an uppercase letter. Everything else is in lowercase except for the second, third, fourth, etc. Naming of the variable name. We want to be descriptive. We don't really want to use 23 character length for our variable names, but we want to be descriptive in our using of a name, so we don't use simple things like X, Y, and Z. We'll use things like index, counter. We'll be descriptive on the names that we use when we assign variable names in our program. So stay tuned, come back, practice a little bit with our little demo that we have in working with variable names, and until next time, get your hands dirty in the code.